The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, delivered by a postal worker who seemed eager to leave my doorstep as quickly as possible. The envelope bore the letterhead of Whitmore Associates, a law firm I had never heard of, from a town called Millbrook that existed somewhere in the forgotten corners of New England. Inside, written in language that felt borrowed from another century, was notification that I had inherited my grandfather's house. Harold Whitmore had been a phantom in our family's conversations for as long as I could remember. My mother spoke of him in careful, measured tones, describing a man who had chosen isolation over connection, silence over explanation. When I was young, I had asked why we never visited Grandfather Harold, and my mother's response had been swift and final. Some people are meant to be left alone. Now, at 94, Harold had died in his sleep, and somehow, through the peculiar mathematics of inheritance law, his house had become mine. The drive to Millbrook took 3 hours through landscapes that seemed to grow increasingly desolate with each passing mile. The October sky hung low and gray, pressing down on forests that had already surrendered their leaves to the approaching winter. The town itself appeared to have been forgotten by time, its main street lined with buildings that might have been prosperous once, but now stood like monuments to economic decline. The few residents I glimpsed moved with the deliberate slowness of people who had learned not to attract attention. Harold's house sat at the end of a winding dirt road, separated from the town by nearly 2 miles of dense woodland. It was a Victorian structure that had once been grand, its elaborate trim work and bay windows speaking of an era when craftsmanship was valued above efficiency. Now, however, the house seemed to sag under the weight of decades of neglect. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and several of the gingerbread decorations had fallen away, leaving gaps like missing teeth in an ancient smile. The interior revealed the careful habits of a man who had lived alone for far too long. Every room had been arranged with geometric precision, furniture positioned at exact angles, books aligned with military discipline. The air carried the scent of old wood and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that I couldn't immediately identify. My footsteps echoed through rooms where dust motes danced in the afternoon light, and I found myself speaking in whispers, as if the house itself demanded reverence. It was on that first night, as I lay in the guest bedroom that Harold had apparently prepared for visitors who never came, that I first encountered the peculiarity that would define my inheritance. Somewhere in the depths of the house, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. The sound was followed by a subtle shift in the air pressure, as if the house itself were breathing. When I investigated, I discovered that the attic door, which I had noticed was secured with not one but 3 separate latches, stood completely open. I closed the door carefully, checking each latch to ensure it was properly secured. The wood was old and warped, but the latches appeared to be in working order. I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. 3 times during that first night, I made the journey to the second-floor landing to close the attic door. Each time I found it standing open, as if mocking my efforts to contain whatever lay beyond. By morning, I had begun to understand that my inheritance was more complex than a simple transfer of property. Harold Whitmore had left me more than a house. He had left me a mystery that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The process of sorting through Harold's belongings revealed the methodical nature of a man who had lived his entire life according to principles that remained opaque to anyone but himself. Every room contained carefully labeled boxes, their contents catalogued with obsessive precision. His clothes had been folded and arranged by color and season. His books, primarily works on local history, genealogy, and what appeared to be anthropological studies of New England folklore, were organized according to a system that defied conventional logic but clearly made sense to their owner. The kitchen cupboards contained enough canned goods to sustain a person through a siege, all arranged with labels facing outward, expiration dates visible at a glance. In the basement, I discovered a workshop where Harold had apparently spent considerable time crafting wooden items, small boxes, carved figurines, and what appeared to be ceremonial objects whose purpose I couldn't immediately determine. Each piece was executed with the skill of a master craftsman, but there was something unsettling about their design, as if they had been created for purposes that polite society would prefer to ignore. The attic door continued its nightly rebellion against my attempts to see. Cure it. I had purchased additional latches from the hardware store in town, installed them with meticulous care, and even gone so far as to prop a chair beneath the handle. Yet each morning I would find the door standing open, the chair moved aside with surgical precision, the latches undisturbed but somehow ineffective. The mystery had begun to consume my thoughts, transforming what should have been a simple inheritance into an obsession that followed me through each day. It was while examining Harold's study that I first encountered references to what he called the arrangement. The phrase appeared in margin notes throughout his books, always written in the same careful script, always accompanied by dates and cryptic numerical notations. His desk calendar revealed appointments that seemed to follow no conventional schedule, meetings with no names attached, times blocked out with only the notation "maintenance required" or "boundary inspection." The appointments occurred with mathematical regularity, suggesting a routine that had governed Harold's life for decades. The study itself was a shrine to organization, every pen in its designated place, every paper filed according to Harold's inscrutable system. The walls were lined with maps of the local area, some dating back to the 19th century, others appearing to be Harold's own creation. These hand-drawn maps focused obsessively on the boundaries of his property, marking elevations, water sources, and what appeared to be the locations of various trees and rock formations. Red ink marked certain areas with symbols that looked vaguely ritualistic, and I noticed that the house itself was surrounded by a perfect circle drawn in the same red ink. Among Harold's papers I found correspondence with local officials dating back decades. Letters to the Town Planning Commission, the Historical Society, and various utility companies all carried the same underlying message. Harold's property was not to be disturbed, developed, or modified in any way. He had apparently spent considerable resources ensuring that the land surrounding his house remained exactly as it had been for generations, purchasing adjacent lots to prevent development and filing legal challenges against any proposed changes to the area. The most disturbing discovery came in the form of a manila envelope marked "For my heir" in Harold's distinctive handwriting. Inside I found a letter that began with the words, "If you are reading this, then the responsibility has passed to you." The letter was brief, but dense with implications I was not yet prepared to understand. Harold wrote of maintaining the quiet, of honoring agreements made by previous generations, and of ensuring that the boundary remains intact. He warned against disturbing the arrangement and emphasized that some traditions must be preserved regardless of personal cost. The letter concluded with instructions that chilled me to the bone. The attic door will open on its own until you understand your role. Do not attempt to investigate the upper room until you have prepared yourself for what you will find. The ledger will explain everything, but only when you are ready to accept the burden that comes with knowledge. As I read these words, I heard the familiar sound of the attic door opening somewhere above me, as if the house itself were responding to my discovery. That night, I made my decision to explore the upper reaches of the house regardless of Harold's warnings. The attic door stood open, as I had known it would, and beyond lay darkness that seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. But as I approached the threshold, I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the October weather, and something in the quality of the air itself warned me that I was not yet prepared for what lay beyond. I closed the door once more, knowing that it would open again, and began to understand that my inheritance came with conditions that had not been mentioned in any legal document. The discovery that would change everything came entirely by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. I was attempting to move Harold's massive oak desk to access the electrical outlet behind it when I noticed that one of the drawers seemed shorter than the others, creating an inconsistency in the desk's internal dimensions. Further investigation revealed a hidden compartment concealed behind a false panel that had been crafted with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything else in Harold's house. Inside the compartment lay a leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. The leather was dark brown, almost black, and bore no title or marking to indicate its purpose. When I opened it, I found pages filled with Harold's careful handwriting, documenting what appeared to be a complex system of record-keeping that spanned more than 60 years. The earliest entries dated back to 1952, when Harold would have been in his 20s, suggesting that he had inherited this responsibility from previous generations. Each entry followed a similar format: a date, a description of items or actions, and a brief note about the results or consequences. The language was formal and precise, as if Harold were documenting scientific observations rather than personal experiences. October 15, 1952, read one of the earliest entries. Place the autumn offering in the upper room. The boundary remains stable. The quiet continues. Another entry from the following spring noted, March 22, 1953, inspected the arrangement. All elements remain in proper position. The agreement holds. As I read deeper into the ledger, patterns began to emerge that suggested Harold had been maintaining some form of ritualistic practice throughout his adult life. The entries spoke of offerings that were placed in specific locations, inspections that were conducted according to a rigid schedule, and maintenance that was required to keep something called the boundary intact. The language was deliberately vague, but the underlying consistency suggested a practice that had been refined over decades of careful observation. The entries became more detailed as Harold aged, revealing a man who had grown increasingly concerned about the effectiveness of his methods. The arrangement weakens with each passing year, he wrote in 1987. The offerings must be increased to maintain the quiet. The boundary requires constant attention. By the 1990s, his entries had taken on a tone of barely controlled desperation. The young no longer understand the old ways, he noted in 1994. When I am gone, who will maintain the peace? Who will honor the agreement? The most chilling entries concerned what Harold referred to as incidents that occurred when his maintenance routines were disrupted. In 1963, he had apparently fallen ill and been unable to perform his regular duties for nearly a month. The entries from that period documented disturbances in the quiet, movements in the boundary, and signs of awakening. When he had recovered sufficiently to resume his activities, Harold wrote, "The arrangement has been restored, but the price was higher than expected. The Hendersons have left town. They will not return." I spent hours poring over the ledger, trying to decode Harold's cryptic language and understand the true nature of his activities. The entries referenced items that were placed or offered, but never specified what these items were or why they were required. He wrote of the upper room as if it were a sacred space, and of the boundary as if it were a physical barrier that required constant maintenance. Most disturbing were the references to the agreement, which suggested that Harold had been party to some form of contract or obligation that extended far beyond his personal lifetime. The ledger's final entries, dated just weeks before Harold's death, revealed a man who had become consumed by anxiety about the future. "My strength fails," he wrote, "and there is no one to whom I can pass the knowledge. The arrangement requires understanding, not just obedience. The boundary demands respect, not just maintenance. When I am gone, what will become of the quiet?" His last entry, written in a hand that trembled with age or fear, contained a message that seemed directed at whoever would eventually discover his records. The attic door opens because the boundary has been breached. The arrangement requires renewal. The offering must be made, or the quiet will end forever. As I closed the ledger, I heard the familiar sound of the attic door opening above me. This time, however, the sound was accompanied by something else, a subtle shifting as if something in the upper room were responding to my discovery. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my next move. I understood now that Harold's warnings had been literal, not metaphorical, and that my inheritance came with responsibilities that extended far beyond property maintenance. The ledger had answered some questions, but it had raised far more troubling ones. What was the nature of Harold's arrangement? What did he mean by the boundary? And most importantly, what would happen if I failed to maintain whatever system he had spent his lifetime perfecting? The need for answers drove me into Millbrook proper, where I hoped to find residents who might remember Harold and could provide insight into his mysterious practices. The town's main street felt like a museum of rural American decline, with more storefronts empty than occupied, and those that remained open seemed to cater to a population that had learned to make do with less. The few people I encountered moved with the deliberate caution of individuals who had grown accustomed to minding their own business. My first stop was the town library, a Carnegie building that had somehow survived the economic decline that had claimed so many other institutions. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Carver who appeared to be in her 70s, regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness when I identified myself as Harold's heir. "We wondered who would inherit the old place," she said, her voice carrying an undertone I couldn't quite interpret. "Harold was very particular about his privacy, very particular indeed." Mrs. Carver confirmed what I had already suspected. Harold had been a fixture in the community for decades, but one who had maintained careful boundaries between himself and his neighbors. "He came to town once a month," she explained, "always on the second Tuesday, always following the same route. He would visit the post office, the bank, the hardware store, and then he would leave. He never socialized, never attended community events, but he was always polite, always respectful, just distant." When I pressed for more details about Harold's habits or any unusual behavior, Mrs. Carver, his responses became more guarded. She spoke of Harold as someone who understood the old ways and who knew things that others had forgotten. When I asked what she meant by this, she simply said, "Some families have responsibilities that others don't understand. The Whitmores always knew their place in the order of things." The post office provided another piece of the puzzle. The postmaster, a man named Robert Mills who had held the position for over 40 years, remembered Harold as a customer who received unusual volumes of mail from historical societies, genealogical organizations, and what appeared to be academic institutions. "He got a lot of packages too," Mills recalled. "Strange things sometimes, always paid extra for careful handling. Never said what was in them, but they were always handled like they contained something precious." More intriguing were Mill's recollections of Harold's correspondence patterns. "He wrote a lot of letters," the postmaster explained. "Always by hand, always on the same cream-colored paper. He had a regular correspondence with someone in Salem, someone in Providence, and others scattered around New England. The letters went out like clockwork, always on the same dates each month. When he stopped writing to someone, you knew something had changed." The hardware store owner, a grizzled man named Tom Bradley, provided the most unsettling insights into Harold's activities. Bradley had been selling Harold specialized items for decades, particular types of rope, specific metal implements, and what he described as ceremonial hardware that Harold had special ordered from craftsmen in other states. He was very precise about what he needed, Bradley remembered. Never explained what it was for, but he knew exactly what specifications he required. Sometimes he would order the same item multiple times, as if he were replacing things that had worn out or been used up. Bradley also recalled periods when Harold's purchasing patterns would change dramatically. "Every few years he would come in looking worried," the store owner explained. "He would buy emergency supplies, extra rope, additional hardware, always paid in cash, never asked for receipts. It was like he was preparing for something, though he never said what." The most disturbing revelations came from my conversations with longtime residents who had lived in Millbrook during the periods when Harold's ledger documented incidents and disturbances. An elderly woman named Sarah Walsh, who had lived in the town for over 80 years, spoke carefully about families who had left suddenly during various decades. "The Hendersons in 63, she recalled. "The Morrison family in 74. The Kowalskis in 89. They all left the same way, quickly, quietly, without explanation. One day they were here, the next day they were gone." When I asked what might have prompted these sudden departures, Mrs. Walsh grew visibly uncomfortable. "Some things are better left undiscussed," she said. "Harold Whitmore was a good man who carried a heavy burden. His family always did what was necessary to keep the peace. That's all anyone needs to know." The pattern that emerged from these conversations was one of a community that had learned to ask few questions and accept certain mysteries as part of their daily existence. Harold had been respected but not loved, appreciated but not understood. The townspeople spoke of him as someone who fulfilled an essential but undefined role, someone whose activities were necessary but not suitable for public discussion. As I prepared to leave town, Mrs. Carver approached me with a final observation that crystallized my growing understanding of Harold's place in the community. "Your grandfather was a guardian," she said quietly. "He protected us from things we didn't need to understand. Now that he's gone, we're all wondering who will take his place. Some responsibilities can't be abandoned, no matter how much we might want to escape them." The drive back to Harold's house felt different than my journey into town. I was no longer simply the inheritor of property. I was the heir to a legacy that carried expectations I was only beginning to comprehend. The house waited for me at the end of the dirt road, its windows dark and uninviting, and I knew that the attic door would be standing open, as it had every night since my arrival. The decision to investigate the attic directly came not from courage, but from the exhaustion that follows weeks of uncertainty. The nightly ritual of closing the attic door had become a futile exercise that left me feeling like a participant in someone else's elaborate joke. Harold's warnings, encoded in his ledger and hinted at by the townspeople, had begun to feel less like genuine concerns and more like the paranoid delusions of an old man who had spent too many years alone with his thoughts. I climbed the stairs to the second floor with the measured determination of someone who had finally chosen action over contemplation. The attic door stood open, as I had known it would, and beyond lay a darkness that seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight rather than reveal what lay hidden. The air that flowed from the opening carried a scent that I recognized from my first night in the house, something organic and slightly sweet, but now identifiable as the smell of old flowers and something else, something that reminded me of the earth after rain. The wooden stairs that led to the attic were steep and narrow, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. Each step creaked under my weight, and I found myself moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that they were crossing a boundary that had been maintained for generations. The temperature dropped noticeably as I climbed, and by the time I reached the top of the stairs, I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. The attic had been transformed into something that defied easy description. The floor was covered with concentric circles drawn in what appeared to be aged salt, their lines precisely measured and carefully maintained. The circles radiated outward from a central point, creating a geometric pattern that seemed to pulse with its own mathematical logic. Within each circle, Harold had placed what he had referred to in his ledger as offerings, items that revealed the true scope of his mysterious activities. The offerings were arranged with ceremonial precision, each item positioned according to principles that remained opaque to me but had clearly been refined over decades of practice. There were photographs, some dating back to the early 20th century, showing families and individuals I didn't recognize. There were personal items, jewelry, clothing, children's toys, all arranged as if they were components in some vast, incomprehensible mechanism. Most disturbing were the handwritten notes, hundreds of them, each folded and placed with care, their contents hidden but their presence suggesting communications with forces that existed beyond conventional understanding. As I examined the arrangement more closely, I began to recognize some of the faces in the photographs. They matched descriptions I had heard in town of the families who had disappeared over the decades, the Hendersons, the Morrisons, the Kowalskis. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. Harold's offerings weren't abstract ceremonial objects. They were memorial items, tokens of remembrance for people who had somehow become part of his supernatural arrangement. The central circle contained items that were clearly Harold's own contributions to the arrangement. There were photographs of family members, including images of my mother as a child, my grandparents, and relatives I had never met. There were personal items that Harold had apparently selected from his own possessions, a pocket watch, a wedding ring, documents that appeared to be legal papers. At the very center of the arrangement lay Harold's final offering, a leather-bound journal that contained what appeared to be a complete record of his family's involvement in the supernatural pact. As I reached for the journal, the temperature in the attic dropped even further, and I became aware of a presence that had nothing to do with the physical world. The air itself seemed to thicken, and I heard what could only be described as whispers, voices that spoke in languages I didn't recognize, conveying messages that bypassed rational understanding and spoke directly to some primitive part of my consciousness. The voices carried emotions, hunger, longing, and a vast, patient intelligence that had been waiting for someone to disturb Harold's carefully maintained boundaries. The journal revealed the full scope of the Whitmore family's dark legacy. For over a century, each generation had maintained a supernatural pact with an entity that existed beneath the house, something ancient and powerful that had been bound by agreements that predated European settlement of the region. The entity provided protection for the local community, ensuring that natural disasters, disease, and other calamities would pass them by. In exchange, the Whitmore family was required to provide periodic offerings and maintain strict ritual boundaries that prevented the entity from extending its influence beyond the confines of the property. Harold's journal documented the gradual deterioration of the arrangement over the decades. The entity had grown stronger with each passing year, while the Whitmore family had grown weaker. The offerings had become more frequent and more substantial, and the boundary had required constant maintenance to prevent the entity from breaking free of its constraints. Harold had spent his entire adult life walking a tightrope between satisfying the entity's demands and preventing it from gaining enough power to escape the supernatural prison that his ancestors had helped create. The journal's final entries revealed Harold's growing desperation as he realized that he was dying without an heir who understood the true nature of their inheritance. The entity had begun to test the boundaries of its confinement, and Harold's declining health had made it increasingly difficult to maintain the ritual schedule that kept the arrangement stable. His death had created a crisis that threatened to unleash something that had been contained for generations. As I read these revelations, the supernatural presence in the attic grew stronger, and I understood that my disruption of Harold's arrangement had weakened whatever barriers he had spent his lifetime maintaining. The entity was awakening, responding to the first disturbance in its prison in over 60 years. The attic door had been opening because the boundary between the physical world and something far more dangerous had begun to collapse. I closed the journal and prepared to leave the attic, but as I turned toward the stairs, I realized that the nature of my inheritance had fundamentally changed. I was no longer simply the owner of Harold's house. I was the guardian of a supernatural prison that contained something that could destroy the very community I had come to protect. The complete truth of the Whitmore family's burden revealed itself through Harold's journal like a disease that spreads through the body, infecting every assumption I had held about my inheritance and my family's history. The journal documented not just Harold's activities, but the experiences of his father, his grandfather, and the generations of Whitmores who had carried this supernatural responsibility since the 1840s, when the first Harold Whitmore had made an agreement that would bind his descendants for over a century. The original pact had been born from desperation during a period when the region was being devastated by crop failures, disease, and what the historical records euphemistically termed Indian troubles. The first Harold Whitmore had been a man of education and skepticism, a Vermont transplant who had purchased land in what would become Millbrook with the intention of establishing a profitable farm. Instead, he had discovered that his property sat above something that had been feared by the indigenous population for generations, an entity that they had successfully contained through their own rituals and taboos. When the native population was driven from the region, their protective ceremonies ended, and the entity began to stir. The first signs were subtle. Livestock died without explanation, crops failed despite favorable conditions, and residents reported dreams that left them exhausted and terrified. The entity fed on suffering and chaos, growing stronger with each tragedy it inspired, and it was only a matter of time before it gained enough power to break free of the natural barriers that had contained it for centuries. Harold Whitmore had been approached by one of the last indigenous shamans in the region, a man who understood that the white settlers' survival depended on maintaining the ancient protections that his people had established. Together, they had crafted a new version of the containment ritual, one that would bind the entity but transfer the responsibility for its maintenance to the Whitmore family. The pact would protect the community from the entity's influence, but it would require each generation of Whitmores to serve as guardians, sacrificing their freedom and ultimately their lives to maintain the supernatural prison. The journal revealed the terrible mathematics of the arrangement. The entity required regular offerings of human suffering to satisfy its hunger, but it was forbidden from directly harming the local population. Instead, the Whitmore family was required to provide substitute offerings, items that carried the psychic residue of pain and loss, tokens that could temporarily satisfy the entity's appetite without actually feeding it living victims. The photographs, personal items, and written notes that Harold had placed in the attic circles were all representations of human suffering, carefully selected and ritually presented to keep the entity dormant. The families who had disappeared over the decades had not been killed by the entity. They had been driven away by the psychological pressure of living in proximity to something that fed on despair. The entity's influence created an atmosphere of dread and hopelessness that affected sensitive individuals, forcing them to flee the region to preserve their sanity. Harold's offerings had included items from these families as a way of acknowledging their sacrifice and channeling their suffering into the ritual that kept the entity contained. The journal also revealed the personal cost of maintaining the arrangement. Each generation of Whitmores had been required to live in isolation, separated from normal human connections to prevent the entity's influence from spreading to their loved ones. They had been forbidden from having children until they were certain they could train an heir to continue the tradition, and they had been required to dedicate their entire lives to the careful maintenance of rituals that grew more complex and demanding with each passing year. Harold's entries documented the gradual deterioration of his mental and physical health under the strain of his responsibilities. The entity's influence had grown stronger over the decades, requiring increasingly elaborate offerings and more frequent ritual maintenance. Harold had spent his final years in a state of constant vigilance, monitoring the boundary between the physical world and the supernatural prison that lay beneath his house. The most disturbing revelation concerned the nature of the entity itself. Harold's research had led him to believe that it was not a single being but rather a manifestation of collective human darkness, the accumulated suffering, hatred, and despair of generations of people who had lived and died in the region. The entity was simultaneously ancient and constantly evolving, feeding on contemporary sources of anguish while maintaining its connection to historical tragedy. Ice that stretched back centuries. The journal's final entries revealed Harold's growing certainty that the traditional methods of containment were failing. The entity had grown too strong for the old rituals to hold it indefinitely, and the modern world had provided it with new sources of power that previous generations had never anticipated. Harold had spent his final years desperately seeking a way to either strengthen the containment or find a permanent solution to the supernatural problem that had consumed his family for generations. As I finished reading the journal, I understood that my inheritance was not just a house and its contents, but a responsibility that would define the remainder of my life. The entity was stirring in response to Harold's death and my disruption of the ritual arrangements, and it was only a matter of time before it tested the boundaries of its prison. The attic door had been opening because the barrier between worlds was weakening, and I was the only person who possessed the knowledge and the legal authority to restore the containment. The weight of this realization settled over me like a shroud, and I began to understand why Harold had lived in such isolation, why the townspeople spoke of him with such careful respect, and why my mother had always discouraged contact with her father. The Whitmore family's burden was not just supernatural but profoundly human, the responsibility of protecting others from forces they could never understand, at the cost of sacrificing their own chances for normal, connected lives. As I prepared to leave the attic, I heard the entity stirring in the depths beneath the house, responding to my newfound knowledge with what felt like satisfaction. It had been waiting for someone to understand the true nature of the arrangement, and now it was ready to test whether I possessed the strength and commitment to continue Harold's work. The days that followed my discovery in the attic passed in a haze of impossible decision-making, as I struggled to comprehend the full implications of my inheritance and the choices that lay before me. Harold's journal had provided answers, but those answers had transformed my situation from a simple property inheritance into a moral crisis that touched the very foundations of my existence. I was no longer merely the owner of a house in rural New England. I was the guardian of a supernatural prison that contained something capable of destroying the lives of hundreds of innocent people. The practical implications of continuing Harold's work became clear as I studied his detailed records of the ritual maintenance required to keep the entity contained. The offerings had to be renewed according to a complex schedule that took into account lunar phases, seasonal changes, and the entity's own fluctuating energy levels. The boundary circles in the attic required constant attention, their salt lines refreshed and their geometric precision maintained through careful measurement and adjustment. Most demanding of all was the psychological toll of living in constant awareness of the supernatural presence beneath the house, knowing that any mistake or moment of inattention could result in catastrophic consequences. The entity itself had grown more active since my initial disruption of Harold's arrangements. I could feel its presence as a constant weight in the house, a malevolent intelligence that watched my every movement and tested my resolve through subtle manipulations of the environment. Temperatures would drop without warning, shadows would move independently of their sources, and the air itself would thicken with an oppressive atmosphere that made breathing difficult. The entity was awakening from decades of dormancy, and its influence was beginning to seep into the physical world. I attempted to contact other members of my family, hoping to find someone who might share the burden of Harold's inheritance or provide guidance about the choices I faced. However, my research revealed that Harold had systematically isolated himself from relatives over the decades, apparently to prevent anyone else from learning about the family's supernatural responsibilities. My mother had been deliberately kept ignorant of Harold's activities, and other potential heirs had been discouraged from maintaining contact through carefully orchestrated estrangement. The loneliness of Harold's existence became painfully clear as I realized that he had spent over 60 years carrying this burden in complete isolation. He had sacrificed any possibility of normal human connections to protect others from knowledge that would either destroy their peace of mind or put them in danger. His reclusiveness had not been the eccentricity of an antisocial personality, but the necessary isolation of someone who carried secrets too dangerous to share. My investigation into the historical records revealed a pattern of tragedy that supported Harold's claims about the entity's influence. The periods when the Whitmore family had failed to maintain their supernatural duties coincided with documented outbreaks of violence, accidents, and unexplained deaths in the region. The entity's power seemed to manifest through the amplification of human darkness, turning ordinary conflicts into devastating tragedies and transforming personal struggles into communal disasters. The most disturbing discovery came through my research into the families who had fled the region over the decades. I was able to trace some of their descendants and learned that many had carried psychological scars from their time in Millbrook that persisted for generations. Children who had lived in the area during periods of supernatural activity had grown up with unexplained phobias, recurring nightmares, and a persistent sense of dread that followed them throughout their lives. The entity's influence extended far beyond its physical containment, affecting anyone who came into contact with its psychic emanations. As I weighed my options, I became increasingly aware that the choice before me was not simply between personal freedom and inherited responsibility. The entity's growing strength suggested that abandoning Harold's work would not simply return me to my previous life. It would unleash something that had been contained for over a century and potentially destroy the lives of everyone in the region. The supernatural prison that Harold had maintained was not just a family obligation but a critical barrier between the civilized world and forces that represented the darkest aspects of human nature. The weight of this realization forced me to confront fundamental questions about duty, sacrifice, and the nature of inherited responsibility. Was I obligated to continue Harold's work simply because I had inherited his property? Did the potential consequences of abandoning the containment justify sacrificing my own life to maintain it? Could I morally choose personal freedom, knowing that my decision might result in the suffering of innocent people? The entity seemed to sense my internal struggle and responded by intensifying its attempts to influence my decision. The supernatural phenomena in the house became more frequent and more aggressive, as if the entity were demonstrating the consequences of inadequate containment. Objects would move without explanation, doors would slam with violent force, and the air would fill with whispers that spoke directly to my deepest fears and insecurities. Yet alongside these displays of power, I began to sense something else in the entity's communications, a kind of respect for the choice I faced, and an acknowledgement of the burden that the Whitmore family had carried for generations. The entity was not simply a malevolent force, but a complex manifestation of human darkness that had developed its own twisted form of honor over the decades of containment. It understood the sacrifice that Harold had made and seemed to recognize that I faced the same impossible choice that had defined my family's legacy. The decision, when it finally came, arose not from careful calculation, but from a moment of clarity that struck me as I stood in Harold's study, surrounded by the evidence of his lifelong dedication to protecting others. I realized that the question was not whether I was capable of continuing his work, but whether I was capable of living with the consequences of abandoning it. The entity's influence had already begun to affect the region, and every day of delay increased the risk that something would happen that could not be undone. I opened Harold's ledger to the first blank page and began to write my own entry, accepting the inheritance that extended far beyond property and possessions. The words came slowly, but with each sentence, I felt the weight of the decision settling into my bones, becoming part of my identity in the same way that it had defined Harold's existence for over 60 years. The process of accepting my role as Harold's successor required more than simply deciding to continue his work. It demanded a fundamental transformation of my understanding of reality and my place within it. The entity beneath the house had been waiting for this moment of acceptance, and as I wrote my first entry in Harold's ledger, I felt its presence shift from testing hostility to something that might, in another context, be called approval. The supernatural prison that had contained it for over a century was not just a matter of ritual and offering, but a relationship built on mutual respect between jailer and prisoner. I began by reconstructing the ritual space in the attic exactly as Harold had maintained it, using his detailed diagrams and measurements to ensure that every element was positioned with the precision that the entity demanded. The salt circles had to be drawn with mathematical accuracy, their lines unbroken and their proportions maintained according to geometric principles that seemed to resonate with forces beyond conventional understanding. The offerings within each circle required careful arrangement, with each item positioned to channel specific types of psychic energy into the containment system. The work was exhausting, both physically and psychologically. Each item I placed in the circles carried the weight of human suffering, and handling them required me to open myself to emotions and experiences that belonged to people I had never met. The photographs of missing families seemed to watch me as I worked, their faces expressing a mixture of gratitude and warning that reminded me of the stakes involved in maintaining the arrangement. The personal items, jewelry, clothing, children's toys, carried psychic residues that spoke of loss, fear, and the desperate hope that someone would remember and honor their sacrifice. The most challenging aspect of the reconstruction was learning to communicate with the entity itself. Harold's journal had described this communication as a form of negotiation, a careful exchange of offerings and assurances that maintained the delicate balance between containment and appeasement. The entity was not simply a mindless force, but an intelligence that had developed its own perspective on the arrangement over the decades. It understood the terms of its imprisonment and had learned to work within those constraints, but it required consistent demonstration that its needs were being acknowledged and respected. My first attempts at communication were clumsy and incomplete, resulting in supernatural manifestations that felt more like reprimands than responses. The entity would express its displeasure through sudden temperature drops, the movement of objects, and an oppressive atmosphere that made it difficult to think clearly. However, as I learned to approach the communication with the same formal respect that Harold had maintained, the entity began to respond more constructively, guiding me toward arrangements that satisfied its requirements while maintaining the necessary boundaries. The townspeople of Millbrook seemed to sense that something had changed in the supernatural equilibrium of their community. I began to receive visitors, elderly residents who had known Harold and understood without explicit explanation that I had accepted his role. They came bearing gifts that were clearly intended as offerings, old photographs, family heirlooms, and written accounts of local tragedies that could be incorporated into the ritual arrangements. Their visits were brief and formal, characterized by the careful politeness of people who understood that they were participating in something that could not be discussed openly. Mrs. Carver from the library brought a collection of historical documents that detailed the region's darker moments, accounts of accidents, disappearances, and unexplained events that had occurred during periods when the Whitmore family's containment had been disrupted. Her gift came with a simple message: your grandfather would be proud that you understand your responsibilities. The documents provided context for Harold's work and helped me understand the broader patterns of supernatural influence that I was now committed to preventing. The postmaster, Robert Mills, provided a different kind of assistance by establishing a network of communication that connected me with other families in New England who carried similar burdens. I learned that the Whitmore family was not unique in maintaining supernatural containments, but part of a scattered community of guardians who had inherited responsibilities that dated back to the earliest European settlements. These families maintained their own versions of the arrangement, each adapted to local conditions and specific supernatural threats. The correspondence with these other guardians provided both practical guidance and emotional support during the difficult transition period. I learned techniques for managing the psychological stress of constant supernatural awareness, methods for strengthening containment rituals, and strategies for maintaining the necessary isolation while still participating in normal human society. Most importantly, I discovered that I was not alone in carrying this burden, even though the work itself required solitary dedication. As the weeks passed, I began to establish my own routine for maintaining the containment. The offerings had to be renewed according to a complex schedule that took into account not just the entity's needs, but the seasonal rhythms that affected its power levels. The boundary circles required daily inspection and frequent adjustment, their geometric precision maintained through careful measurement and ritualistic attention to detail. The communication with the entity became a regular practice, a formal exchange that allowed me to monitor its condition and respond to any changes in its behavior. The most significant change in my life was the gradual acceptance of isolation as a necessary component of my role. Like Harold before me, I found myself maintaining careful boundaries between my public life and my supernatural responsibilities. The entity's influence required constant vigilance, and the knowledge of its presence created a psychological burden that could not be shared with people who lacked the context to understand its implications. Yet this isolation was not the complete disconnection from humanity that I had initially feared. The townspeople of Millbrook had accepted me as Harold's successor, and their subtle acknowledgement of my role provided a form of community that was different from normal social connections, but no less meaningful. I had become part of a tradition that extended back generations, connected to a history of sacrifice and dedication that gave meaning to the solitary work of maintaining the boundary. The attic door no longer opened on its own. The supernatural manifestations in the house had ceased, replaced by a watchful quiet that indicated the entity's return to dormancy. The boundary between worlds had been restored, and the containment that Harold had maintained for over 60 years was once again secure. The arrangement would continue, said down through generations of Whitmores who would carry the burden of protecting others from forces they could never understand. In my final entry in Harold's ledger, I wrote the words that would guide whoever inherited this responsibility after my death. The boundary holds because someone chooses to maintain it. The arrangement continues because someone accepts the burden. The quiet endures because someone understands that some forms of darkness can only be contained, never destroyed. The attic door remains closed because someone stands guard, watching and waiting, ensuring that the things that should remain hidden never see the light of day. The house settled into its new rhythm, and I began the work that would define the remainder of my life. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees with the sound of whispered secrets, and inside, the entity beneath the house returned to its patient sleep, contained but never defeated, waiting for the next generation to inherit the burden of keeping the world safe from the darkness that dwells in the spaces between what we know and what we fear.